We'll go ahead and get started. Hey, hi everyone. I'm Jeffrey Smith. I don't know. I look forward to meeting you all if we can get together here in September for our first official meeting. John called me a couple weeks ago and was saying he'd like, wanting to see if we had an opportunity. I was like, well, why don't we just make that a informal August meeting for you to show us this new tool that he's developed, that ECRA has developed, and it'll give us opportunity for everybody to have an hour or so of respite from the craziness of the first week, to think about some assessment things coming forward. Because Lord knows we don't need something else to stress about. But I'm glad you all could join us together. It looks like we have almost 50 people, and we had like 65, 70 people say yes to the calendar invite. So maybe we'll get a few more people come here at the last minute. I did put one other thing on the agenda that if you're interested with the new law related to auto accelerate, the governor just signed a modification of that that we can talk a little bit about after John's presentation. But I know most people came to listen to that, and so I thought we can just go ahead and start with that. And John, I'll let you introduce yourself more than just me saying your name, and you can say who you are as you're part of your group. And
All right, very good.
So thanks a lot, man.
All right, very good. Well, thanks, Jeffrey. I really appreciate having the opportunity to come here today and talk with the group, and thank you to all the CADCA members. You guys are always so welcoming when ECRA does come to speak. So, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of conversation going on across Illinois on this conversion from SAT to ACT, and those of you that know me, my name's John Gatta. I'm the CEO of ECRA Group, and many of you are probably familiar with the work that ECRA Group does across the state and across the nation. But, one of the things that we really like to, think of ourselves as is, as changes happen within the environment of education, specifically changes that relate to data analytics or reporting or assessment or things that ECRA does a lot of work on, is getting out in front of these issues to help, school systems so that we can sort of remove the burden and remove some of the anxiety that comes with some of these major transition pieces. And so, we work very closely with a lot of the state associations too. We have deep partnerships with pretty much every single state association representing the different pieces. I was just down with, at a meeting with all of the state execs, and this issue continues to come up in terms of where is this going at the high school level? It feeds into the broader conversation of how is the state thinking about re-level setting some of the proficiency standards and everything that goes along with the state assessment program. And so I thought that it would be a good idea for ECRA to get out in front of this and try to provide a solution to districts that could sort of ease the transition. And what I'm going to go over today is some backdrop, some theory. So there is some professional learning in the front of this that just comes with understanding how all of this stuff fits together from a measurement and psychometric standpoint, but then closing with an opportunity that we developed for school systems in partnership with the Illinois Principals Association to make this transition easier. And so before I get started, I'd like to say a couple of things for the clients in the room. Everything that I say or everything that I show in here, you already have. So you could reach out to support@ecragroup.com and make sure that you kind of know where you can get access to that. And I don't know if this is being recorded. I think this thing is being recorded, but I also want to say that there is on the ECRA Group website under the featured solutions, there's an Illinois SAT to ACT projections with all the information that I'm going through here today. One of which is sort of a condensed version of the things I'm talking about here too. So if there's a recording of this, great, but there's also more of a condensed version of this on that site as well, just so that if you want to make sure that you write things down, although it sounds like I'm being transcribed anyway with a bunch of AI bots, so I better be careful what I say. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to talk up front about this transition and from a psychometric standpoint. Some of this stuff is really elementary, I understand, but just to get anchored here, right, the state is going from SAT to ACT, and we know that the tests are different, and we know that there's some obvious structural differences: SAT, math, and English-based reading and writing, summing to a composite, and then ACT having the four major components: math, reading, English, science, and that averaging to a composite. But what we know from a measurement standpoint, right, or a psychometric standpoint is the theory behind all this stuff, right, is there are what we call latent constructs that ultimately we're interested in, right? And from a state perspective or a reporting perspective, usually English language arts and math are sort of those two big constructs that at least the state assessment program has been focused on. As there's been science as well, but the core of it being English language arts and math. And so when you think about English language arts and math for the SAT, that maps on to the English-based reading and writing, but for the ACT, that maps on to reading and English. And then for the math component, basically it maps on to both of the math components. Why am I starting this way? Well, I'm starting this way because, we do have to understand that although these tests are different, and there's different structures and times, and you could crack open the test blueprints and do standards alignment, and you could do a lot of things to justify that and make a pretty compelling argument that tests are very different. You certainly could make that argument. But if you just look at it through the lens of the data that they produce, right, and the relationship between the data that's produced, what you find is that in large part, these scores are exchangeable, right? And so what you're looking at here is correlations between math scores on the SAT and math scores on the ACT, 0.89. Correlations between ELA scores produced from the SAT and sort of composite ELA produced from the ACT, 0.88. At a composite level, you're talking about over 0.9, 0.93, right? So what is the takeaway here? The takeaway here is while the test blueprints and the tests themselves do appear that there are differences, in large part, they produce scores that are exchangeable, right? I mean, some of these correlations, 0.93, that's pretty much the correlation you'd expect from a test correlating to itself. Tests don't correlate to themselves perfectly either, right? If you ask a student to come take the SAT test, right, send him home, tell him to come back the next day, take the same exact SAT test, he's not going to get the same score, right? And so there's a correlation between the SAT and ACT that's not that different from tests correlating from themselves. And the reason I say this is the motivation behind a lot of what I'm going to talk about here today is how can you interface with the data in a way that you can sort of use them both exchangeably, especially in this first year of transition where you're going to have you may have some data that you have to use from the SAT suite. You may have some data that you have to use from ACT, but how can you develop a system to where you can just use it exchangeably and nothing really matters? So a couple of theory points here that I want to cover because it relates to the use case of how do you actually apply some of this stuff in practice. So a lot of times you hear the word equating, right? That's a term that's used a lot in the psychometric literature. And it's important to understand that when we talk about equating, right, we're really talking about the comparability of scores from different forms of the same test, and that equating adjusts for differences in test difficulty, but not differences in content. So what is the example? So when students take an ACT test or they take an SAT test, they all take different versions of that test, right? And there's revolving versions, right? What the test publishers do is they make sure that when they report a scale of 1 to 36, that it means the same thing regardless of what test form you've taken, right? Even though one kid may have gotten 50% of the items right, the other kid may have gotten 60% of the items right, but they both might have a 25, right? That's equating, right? Linking, on the other hand, it refers to statistical methods to ensure comparability of scores from different tests with similar but not identical content. So linking considers both test difficulty and test content. So in a true conceptual standpoint, what we're talking about between ACT and SAT is really linking. Okay. But then we have this word concordance. And the reason I'm saying because all these terms float around, right, in the marketplace. You see equating, you see linking, and a lot of you are probably most familiar with the term concordance, right? And concordance refers to equating methods applied to a linking context. So that's abstract. I understand that. But it really is it represents the converted score of an individual student that they would have likely achieved had they taken the other test on the exact same day under the exact same conditions. So the takeaway of this is that concordance, right? You guys have all seen ACT to SAT concordance tables, or I'm going to show you one of them here today as well. But believe it or not, the concorded score that you use on those tables, right, or the score conversions that are reported in concordance tables do not represent the score that a student would actually get if they actually sat on to take the other exam. Concordance tables, when you think about all that they do, is they say, what is the percentile on ACT? What is the corresponding percentile on SAT? And they're just matching distributions, but it actually does not represent the score that you'd expect a student to score. Right. And that's a really important piece as we talk about going forward here, because when we think about the different use cases for how to use this is concordance tables, and I referenced the document that many of you may have used or seen, is concordance tables are very useful to convert existing scores for use in statistical analysis or for use within a district policy or procedure. But you should not use concordance tables to predict how a student will score on the other test should they take the test at some point in the future. That's not what concordance tables do. And you certainly shouldn't use concordance tables to convert aggregate statistics, right? And what I mean by that is you can't take the average SAT score that you had last year or the year before and say, what would be the equivalent on ACT, and use the concordance table to look it up, right? That doesn't work either. Concordance tables are for individual students. They're not for aggregates. So if you were to use concordance tables in that context, you'd have to convert all of the old scores first at the individual student record level and then perform all your aggregation, right? So what are some of the use cases for this? And I'm going to demonstrate some of the different use cases, and then hopefully we can have a conversation, in large part. So the first use case that is pretty meaningful in using these pieces is to use concordance tables to convert historical SAT scores to ACT scores so you can preserve the ability to monitor proficiency and college readiness over time. So this year, spring 2025, all of you are going to take the ACT. You guys aren't, but your students are going to take the ACT, right? So in some sense, you might be thinking, well, we sort of have to start over from our longitudinal perspective, right? Well, that's not really true, right? Because one of the things that you can do is you can use concordance tables to convert all of the historical scores. And then when you're reporting to the Board of Education, all of this in the context of how do you communicate better and how do you, make sure that you understand more readily what all this means. And so I'm going to demonstrate these use cases using the actual ECRA platform. So one of the ways in which you can do this is you can say, let's say for mathematics, for example, right? If you went historically and equated all the old SAT scores to ACT scores, you could have as many years of trend as you want. And those are comparable scores because you're using concordance tables the right way, the way they're intended to be used. So when you take the ACT this year, you could report a 4-year trend, 5-year trend, 6-year trend, right? And that's a very meaningful way to use concordance tables so that you're not just reporting scores on a new test, you're reporting it in the context of what likely your scores would have been over the last 3 or 4 years had you been taking the ACT the whole time, right? And you can do that from a proficiency standpoint, right? Basically, and what I mean by proficiency specifically is you can convert all your historical SAT scores to ACT scores, but then reapply the ACT benchmarks to the historical scores, right? So now you have a historical trend on ACT related college and career readiness benchmarks from a trend perspective. But of course, you could also do this from a scale score, perspective as well. As you could say, I want to look at, mathematics, and I want to look at equated ACT in the same way. If you wanted to see what would have been your average scale score on the ACT over the last 3, 4, 5, 6, however many years of data that you wanted to convert, things would proceed the same way. And so that is a very straightforward but very useful way to use concordance tables to add context, sort of historically of where you've been. And as you report to the board and as you report to staff and talk to stakeholders, giving them some historical context. The other logical application of these kinds of methods, right, is to predict future ACT scores from prior PSAT scores for goal setting. So what do I mean by this? Is all of you got to take the ACT this year in the spring again, right? It's pretty easy to have visibility into where you're going to score, right? Just because students took the PSAT last year, right, in even grades 9, 10, leading up as many years as you want to go, right? Those correlations that I showed you, right, and the interconnectedness of all these tests means that you can predict with really, really precise accuracy how individual students and groups of students are going to perform on the ACT this year without ever having seen them take the test for a variety of years, right? That's a pretty straightforward thing to do. And so I want to sort of show you exemplars of what that looks like. And so if you think about, I'm just looking at grade 11 here for the sake of this example, and I think I'll keep math as the main thing that I'm looking at for this demonstration to keep it nice and clean and easy. So mathematics 24-25. Okay. This is the exact same data, right? Applied to the exact same set of kids, right? One of the projections is projecting to ACT, the other is projecting to SAT, right? These are the projected proficiency rates that we would expect, and I'm going to show you kind of how that looks at an individual student level, right? The first thing that you're going to notice in this example, and all of you are going to see it in your own data as well, is if you're comparing college and career readiness benchmarks from SAT to college and career readiness benchmarks to ACT, your proficiency rates will drop. Okay. So, but that doesn't mean, right? That doesn't, as you all know about how proficiency is, that doesn't mean anything relative to actual performance, right? But you just have to understand that because you can, through this equating methodology, you can try to get more apples to apples, right? And so that's to the College Board versus the ACT college and career readiness benchmarks. Now, the ISB benchmarks for ACT, right, are more rigorous. Those are going to be closer to what you'd expect out of the ACT. So that's one thing to think about. So, but the point of the matter is, just like you have been doing, this first chart I want to show you is this is what you've been doing now for a while. This is basically your PSAT score in grade 10, and now it's your SAT score in grade 11, and you've been predicting where students should score on the SAT based off of scores leading up to that, right? And you've been looking at individual probabilities that they're going to hit certain proficiency benchmarks or scores, right? This has been happening all along. But the reality of things are it's the exact same process with the same degree of accuracy. You can just as easily predict the ACT now for the sake of goal setting, just as easily as you could predict the SAT. So you should have just as good a visibility this year into how students will perform on the ACT as you had all along to the SAT. Because again, all of this stuff is so correlated, right? That if you use the concordance tables properly, if you use the right prediction models, this stuff is spot on accurate. And so this is now looking at the PSAT in grade 10, but instead of looking at what the expected performance is on the SAT, now we're looking at the expected performance on the ACT, right? And we can do that for each and every student to see where their actual score, where we would project the student would, perform on the various assessments into the future. So this particular one, they had a 550 on the PSAT last year. We're expecting them to have a 25, right? This one, down here, let me go down. They had a 330 on the last year, expected to have 14. So how do you use this? Well, this is looking at it, through the lens of the individual student and the probability. Each student has a probability that they're going to meet the college and career readiness benchmarks on the ACT. But then one of the things that's very easy to do once you have run that data through is then to say, I'm going to drag in a new report here. So given all that, if I were to aggregate that up, then what would I expect? So what are all of you should be looking at this from the standpoint of, all right, so what are we expecting for my school district now for the ACT coming up in the spring? Well, you could do that overall, as a district. Overall, your district is going to be 41%. The low end is going to be 39. The high end is going to be 43. You could list all your buildings and say this building is going to have 42% proficiency. This building is going to have 40%, right? It'll give you a low and a high range, but it will basically give you that for each and every iteration of the data that you're interested in, all subjects, right? Even all student groups. So if you wanted to know, as we transition from SAT to ACT this year, what is the expected proficiency rates that we're going to observe based on all of our different student groups? And so the use case for this is a couple of things. One is goal setting, right? Because all of you have to do some set of goal setting in the beginning of the year, right? And you report to the board to some extent, right? Where you've been and kind of where you see things going this year, right? You all are in a position, right, given the available data that's out there, to, when you present to the boards in the fall, to give them some visibility in where your scores are going to land in the spring on the ACT, even though it's a brand new test. And it will be pretty spot on. Right. And so that's one of the ways to think about this. In addition, at the individual student level, right, as you start talking to parents and you start talking to other stakeholders, guidance counselors, so on and so forth, how do you get them to understand that transition, right? Of we used to talk about SAT, now we're talking about ACT, and making sure that they have visibility into where a student is likely to score as well. Moving on, I got a lot of windows open here. Sorry about all this. Oh. The other thing that you can do, so we talked about the use case of just translating or exchanging historical scores for the sake of trend analysis. We've talked about using the concordance tables and prediction models to give you visibility into where your students are going to score on the ACT this year. Now, this use case is to monitor growth and evaluate program effectiveness, regardless of whether a student took the ACT or SAT. So during this transition period, you don't want to sort of decide, well, we're just not going to do our normal processes of evaluating impact or looking at how things performed, right? And you don't need to, because like I had said before, you can pretty much use these scores interchangeably. And so one of the ways that you can also interface with this is to say, well, it's cool that we can look into the future, but we can also look into the past, right? So we could look last year to 23, 24, right? And we can actually assess, and you could do this at the end of this year as well for 24, 25, you can assess the rates of growth that existed onto the ACT and ask the same kind of questions you've always been asking. Like, let's say, did the Algebra 2 tutoring session actually result in accelerated rates of growth, right? Basically, what's happening here is all those scores are being equated. The prediction models are giving every student a projection onto the ACT. We're looking at where they actually scored. And then we're quantifying the impact as an effect size. So we can still monitor growth, right, as the crossover happens from SAT to ACT. So the takeaway I want you all to take from this is that it really doesn't matter which test they're taking, right? You can continue to set goals, you can continue to make projections, you can continue to identify students, and you can still evaluate growth even though they took different assessments. Growth in the education landscape or in a psychometric landscape never requires that things be on the same scale. It never has, right? And so you can make that transition, I think in a pretty straightforward way. And then the last use case is, how do we use concordance tables to convert existing individual student scores to apply a district policy or procedure? This is really useful from the standpoint of all of you have, I'm sure, just scenarios where you're talking about an individual student, right? Or a guidance counselor is talking about individual students or talking to parents, right? Well, one of the nice things to do during this transition is to so here's all your students, right? We're in Ecker's learner profile. And when you bring up an individual student during this transition, like, report both scores alongside each other. So when you're looking at a student, it's like here was their SAT score, but here was their equated ACT score, right? Or when they take the ACT this year, provide an equated SAT score along with it. So during a transition, people can use the scores, right? That they may have policies from it, they may have procedures, they may have ways of doing business that requires one score versus the other. If you always report both, I mean, you got to make sure you're indicating which one's equated or not. But it does provide an easier transition when you're pulling up scores. You could look at either score or either scale, right? And pretty much use those exchangeably and make all the same decisions as you would otherwise. So in closing with that, and then hopefully open this up for questions, is we have a special offer through our partnerships with IPA, the Illinois Principals Association. And I mentioned that all this information is online. I want to go through it a little bit here today and then answer questions. We wanted to make this really accessible to school districts during this transition, and that was important to some of the state associations as well. And so, how can we provide an opportunity for school districts to engage with us to have some of this work done in a way that makes the transition easier? Now, again, all the clients in the room, you don't have to worry about all this. You already have all this, and so just reach out to us if you want to know where to find that within your platform. So the way the offer is structured is that you can get all your aggregate projected grade 11 ACT proficiency levels. And just to make sure we're all understanding exactly what we're talking about here is we will take all of your individual student scores, right, from the PSAT, from the prior year, and we will provide you this report, which gives you aggregate proficiency levels for all your buildings, all your subjects, all your subgroups relative to the ACT college and career readiness benchmarks. And we can provide that for a flat fee of $2,500, regardless of district. If you're over 10,000 students, there's probably not many of those over here, then call us and we can talk about pricing. But basically, a flat fee of $2,500, we can provide that aggregate reporting for you. So you will have visibility into what your proficiency rates are going to look like this spring, right? And you could message that to your board and your internal and external stakeholders to help you during that transition. As an option to that, you could, for $1 a student, you could have online access to do the things that I just showed you, right? And if you exercise that option, then you'll be able to look historically, like I showed. You'll be able to look historically on the equated metric, right? We'll take up to 5 years of data. So we'll equate all your historical. So you could look historically, and you can slice and dice this by all your variables too, obviously. But you'd be able to look historically at your equated scores. You would be able to interface with the projections that are in that PDF report that comes with the flat 2,500, but you'd be able to then jump into the platform and look at individual students and then, slice and dice and do all those pieces as well. And that is an additional $1 too, but it's optional. So you could, if this were to help you, you could say that actually all we really need are the aggregate projections, for $2,500, or I don't want to exercise the option of $1, and that's all you need to do. Or, you could say, actually, I see both being useful, and so then that would be $2,500 plus $1. But you do have to have the first piece to have the second piece, right? That's the only piece with that. And so with that, hopefully I can answer any questions in any capacity. You can ask us anything. You can ask us what we're hearing from the state. We're very connected to all of these conversations, at the state level. So if anything's on your mind in terms of what's happening at the state level or related to the methodologies that we're using to do this, or just related to the offer that we're providing here today, happy to answer any questions. I muted. So
Thanks, John. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Um, for John now?
I haven't heard this stated explicitly by anyone, and I'm hoping that you know. Is ISB going to be using the regular ACT benchmarks for proficiency, or are they setting their own targets like they did with SAT?
I mean,
To
there's
be determined, but the whispering, right? Yeah, it definitely is to be determined, right? So I don't want to set a message, especially since I got a bunch of AI transcribers in here. I don't want to send the message that they have decided that they're doing that. They have not, but they have decided that they're going to go through, a resetting process, right? Um, I think in the beginning, I think it's likely that they will adopt the ACT proficiency benchmarks, but again, that is not a decision. That is uncertain, but I think it's likely.
I mean, the school year has started. It'd be kind of nice to know what they're expected to do at the end of this year.
Yeah, I don't think you'll know that until the data. I don't think you're going to know where they set those benchmarks for a little while still.
Awesome.
But that said, you can know where you're going to land on the college and career readiness benchmarks through this, through what I've described here. And we really did try to provide a very easy entry level price point for people. $2,500. You can have visibility to just help you through this, help you through this process.
Thanks, John.
Hi, John. This is Justin Smith from Woodstock. Just real quickly, could you talk a little bit about why the ACT scores, the proficiency scores would be less than the SAT scores? I was under the assumption that, I don't know why I was thinking this, but maybe that the ACT proficiency scores would actually be higher because the SAT scores were kind of artificially inflated from the state to align with the Parker IAR test.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we got to make sure that that everyone's picking up on the subtlety of what you just said, right? It's going to go down if you compare college board, college and career readiness benchmarks to ACT college and career readiness benchmarks. It's going to be more similar if you compare ISB imposed benchmarks on SAT to the new ACT, right? Because we know that ISB was more rigorous, right? The ACT benchmarks they're not perfect, but they are more aligned to the ISB benchmarks on the college board than the college board benchmarks. So if ISB were to say we're going to adopt the college and career readiness benchmarks from ACT as the proficiency benchmarks, you're going to probably see similar. You won't see the drop I said as much here because I went college board ACT. You'll see something more in line. But that'll obviously change depending on where your distributions sit at the cut, right? One of the things that's difficult about proficiency distributions in general, when you're just drawing a line in the sand and cutting a distribution at a certain point, where your distributions overlays with that, and the probabilities that fall from that means that it's not always going to move in the direction you think it moves, right? There's a little bit more variation. But you can know if you go through this process, though, you'll know exactly because that'll all get taken into account, right?
When you're doing those projections, do you equate and then project, or do you project and then equate? Or is that what you tried to say on that earlier slide about not using it for some things? Like I have SAT scores. Are you using the SAT projection models to get to what the SAT score should be next year and then equating that to an ACT score? Or are you taking the current SAT score,
equate? If I understand, equate, then project.
Okay.
So,
so before what the current ACT score would be, and
right,
then project to what it will be in the future.
And then build your models build your crossover models. That's right.
Hi, John. I was wondering if there's ever been conversation at the state level about administering these in Spanish.
I haven't heard anything specific on that recently. That hasn't been the focus of the conversation, at least not the conversations that I've been, around. I haven't heard that in any capacity, talked about. That doesn't mean it's not. I have not been part of those conversations. So does this make sense to people? Is this something that you would find useful? Because the other thing I'd like to throw out there is that if it's close but not perfect, ECRA's always open to, if there's something else that would be more helpful, let us know.
John, on the part one, the aggregated projected grade level ACT proficiencies,
Yes.
are we getting, is that, I mean, like your little PDF or your little images are PDFs and stuff like that. Would there be, are we getting flat files and such with that? I mean,
With this one, you're basically getting what we call a data brief. You're getting a PDF report of all of the aggregate predictions, all the aggregate projections, right? To get all the individual student level would be the extra $1 a student. And then at that point, you could get to the platform, you could download it through the platform, but then we could also provide you, we could provide you Excel files too. But to get all the student level stuff would require the $1 a kid.
gotcha.
But we can crank this. The other thing that I want to make sure people understand is we can crank this really, really fast, right? So because I know it's kind of a, something that you'd want to do sooner than later, right? As the year gets going. So once we're in receipt of your data, within a couple of days, you'll get your results once we're in possession of all the data. But these files are pretty easy to get because you have them all, right? You have, basically what we need. We need it in a basic enrollment file with the demographics, and then we need your College Board file that has the SAT. But all this stuff actually comes through iWAS too, so it's pretty easy. And we can even pull it for you. A lot of districts just, they just give us their logins and we go get what we need.
Other questions or thoughts for John? Or things that you wish that he would do for us? John and ECRA have been very nice to CADCA. For those of you that have not been in CADCA for a long time, several years ago when we were first switching to SAT, many of us, I don't know how many districts, John, I don't know, probably 40 or 50 districts.
It was the bulk of CADCA that participated.
Right. Provided numerous files for numerous years to John, and he created CADCA level standards for the College Board for growth, single year growth, because at that time College Board hadn't been publishing them. And so for many of us that wanted to use that kind of stuff to try to analyze things, they very kindly helped support us in a lot of those things.
Yeah, and that's and thank you for those comments, Jeffrey. But I would actually throw out to the group, we're always open to those kinds of collaborations too, right? If there are certain kinds of things or research type projects like that collectively we can all work together to produce things for the benefit of everybody, we're always open to doing that.
Could I ask you just to reiterate, were you saying in general, the biggest purpose for this particular report would be able to predict and communicate with the school board or, district administration what to anticipate in the spring?
Yes, I think that's the biggest, I think that's the single of just the first part, right? If you just got the first part, I think the main use case is exactly, it's to help you set goals for the year. So if there's things that you have to set goals as part of your school improvement process, or you have to in various settings, you have to put a number down, right? But also, yes, to communicate to internal and external stakeholders, in addition to the Board of Education, that all of you know that this transition is happening. We've analyzed all of our data, and this is what you could expect, a year from now, us to be reporting on. This is what we're predicting, given this change. You get out in front of it. And it's always, it always looks, anytime you can be proactive and be out in front of a conversation and really looking prospectively into the future of what giving people some visibility into what's likely to come is, everybody likes that. It's a much more action-oriented framework to be prospective than retrospective, generally speaking. Any other questions, comments? Well, I think if obviously all of you, if you can email me with questions, you can the other thing that you can do as well is if you go to the page on our website, again, is under featured solutions, the SAT to ACT projections. There's a bunch of information up here, but you can also, if you want to get started, want more information, you either email me, fill out this form, for the clients in the room, email support@ecogroup.com. And if you're wondering where this stuff is within your platform, we can get back to you right away.
All right. Thank you, John. We're going to take just, I have two little agenda items for the group, even though this isn't a formal CADCA meeting. One is I wanted to encourage you as well. We're still looking for people to host a host CADCA each month for the rest of the year. We've got a couple of districts that have signed up. If you would like to do that, whether it's one of the in-person ones, or even if you want to help be in charge of some of the virtual ones, which those may be already taken up, they're at the top of the CADCA running agenda, which is in the calendar invite I sent everybody. It should be there anyways. That says 24-25 meeting dates, and there's kind of a little sign up that you can do. And so I would encourage you, if you would like to help with that, that would be great. I also wanted to welcome Amy McCrindle is also going to be helping us on the leadership group, which the leadership team is essentially, sometimes we've found that CADCA meetings kind of happened and we hadn't really done very much planning. So we're trying to just meet a little bit ahead of time starting last year, just to make sure we have all our ducks in the rows, and like people who are hosts, especially people who are new hosts, have all the support that they need to make this so that we all feel like we're getting a benefit out of the monthly meetings. And so I welcome Amy to helping meet and helping organize that this way. I think Bill was saying now we have someone from each county that's on the group to kind of help coordinate that. So there's our representation. The other thing I wanted to bring up, I don't know if you all noticed that the governor last week signed some edits to the Accelerated Placement Act. I put those into the agenda. Most immediately, I know our team has been discussing what they did is they said for the current years, they eliminated the meets part of meets or exceed the state standards. But the problem is for like grade 9 and 10, for those of us that are using that for College Board, or 8, 9, and 10, if you're using that for the PSAT 8 for 8th graders, a concern is that College Board doesn't actually have a meets level that they publish. They only have a meets or, I'm sorry, they don't have an exceeds level. They only have, like when you look at their little red, yellow, green, that green is meets or exceeds. And there's not an official exceeds level. So that leaves open what should one be using if they wanted to use the exceeds as opposed to the meets and exceeds, which we all used last year. I had a couple of email exchanges with Sharm, I can't remember the lady's name. She's who I was referred to in that office. And her first response was, well, we're going to be publishing all new stuff with the ACT. And I was like, yeah, but that doesn't help us this year because we use last year's test to place students for next year. And she hasn't responded to that yet. So I will try to keep CADCA approved, but I don't know if anyone started thinking about that part of it or have had questions already about that or knew that. I don't know. Any thoughts about that? Or maybe other people have a better main line into an information conduit at ISB and can provide. I've already heard some guidance about that. No? Okay.
I can just share what I heard real quick. It's just I talked to Megan last week down at the state, and she mentioned that there wasn't a lot that was fully approved yet with the contract, the ACT contract. So they're starting to put some guidance together, and they should have something by mid-September, I heard. So
Well,
they're kind of in the waiting game until then, I think.
yeah, I think what I'm saying is that this isn't the ACT. This is still the SAT.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeffrey. My bad.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you all, but like we start placing students for next year this fall, at the end of this fall, we're using last April's score, SAT scores. And so if we're now only using exceeds and not meets or exceeds, that changes the dynamic. I included a quick synopsis of a couple of other things. They did change some of the language around parental notification and the opt-out process. It basically just makes it really clear that you really do have to give parents the option to do this, and that if they don't respond, the default is that you have to accelerate them going further, in the future. And then it changes some of the language starting in 27, 28 as well. But I put links there. So that's all I don't know. I just kind of want to make sure everybody was there and see if anybody else had heard anything about that exceeds and the removal of meets.
I just want to confirm. So, like, the way I was aware of this, but the way I was reading it was so that part on the bottom that says that they may, sorry, now I lost my spot. They shall be automatically enrolled, switching to shall allow for automatic eligibility. So if it's a district that has like open enrollment, do they have to do anything this?
I find that confusing. So this is starting the 27, 28, because that first statement says shall allow, but then if you look in the numerals 1, 2, and 3, it still says it says shall be automatically eligible to enroll. So my understanding is that it is making it a lot more optional going forward.
Right.
That starts in 3 years, 2 years, whatever, the 27, 28 year.
Am I reading this correct? Sorry, am I reading this correctly that they got rid of the meets for English and math, but science is still meet or exceeds?
Well, I guess I assume that most people for science are using the ISA, so that didn't apply to my question about College Board not having an exceed. The actual law does say science, I believe, as well. I think I forgot to copy the meets, the cross out part. Sorry, because since I copied and pasted this from a PDF, it didn't just automatically do that. Here, I just added it. But please look at the actual law, don't trust me.
Jeff, you're right. In the law, I just clicked on the Public Act, and it does have the cross out of meets for science as well. If you go to that link you have on there.
It also isn't.
Can have a huge effect on the number.
Yeah. Well, and then I wondered, for those of you that know the legal language a little bit better than I do, it does say by no later than the beginning of the 27, 28 years. So does that mean that we could already be using that? Like we don't need to keep with the meets or exceeds, that we could already go to the eligible part? Or does that mean, I don't know. I find that to be confusing too.
I would read it like that. I would read it like at the last date available, 27, 28, you're doing this, so you could start doing it now.
I read it that same way. That's how we're reading it.
So theoretically, we could all go to a more optional. All right. Anyone else have thoughts or questions about this?
My only question I would have, if we go to the optional component, right? If we have open enrollment for all of our accelerated classes, do we still have to have record of parent community, like opt out? Or is it just, I don't understand how that would work.
I guess the question I'd have too is if it's going to open enrollment, then why would they get so strict on the parents signing off? Because if you can get away with having an open enrollment, why would you need parents to sign off?
So I can say, like, we are an open enrollment district. We have been for like ever. But I think because nobody really knew exactly what this was, we did an opt-out form last year, but it seems obsolete. Like, you wouldn't need that, because if you are open enrollment or you're thinking about doing that, like, any kid can take a course. Now that's different than a teacher recommendation, which we make that available so people can see a teacher recommendation and then they can take whatever class they want. But we do have like a form they fill out if it goes against the teacher recommendation, and that's a form that we use. But there's not a barrier for a kid to not take an AP class in my district. So I don't know why we would need an opt-out form.
Okay, we do the same thing in Geneva. They can take any course they want. Again, if it's against recommendation, we just have a parent. We do have a parent sign off if it's against recommendation.
Yeah. So did you do any kind of form last year for this?
We did a form that basically said your student was eligible, and then we kind of told them what courses, so that when they went to the course selection, they could choose if they so desired. We didn't honestly like automatically enroll, because we also wanted our students to balance like the number of more rigorous courses they were taking.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But I agree with you. I think it could be obsolete because they can take whatever course they choose.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone else would be interested in this, but if there's some of us who wanted to have a place where we could document the decisions that we're ultimately making by district, just to see the different kinds of policies that are going to exist or the way people are implementing it, that would be something that I would be interested in.
I agree. That would be very helpful, Mary.
Do you think that the parent sign off is in place because the exceeds part isn't going away and it's the optional for meets?
Good question.
Because like if I exceed, I have to automatically be placed, but if I meet, I'm given the option to be automatically placed.
Yeah, I think that makes more sense.
But if you're an open enrollment district and the kid isn't necessarily meeting by a test score, then is there like a parent piece? I don't know. It's just tricky.
And if you're automatically placed, but you don't want to take it, you still can opt out because of what someone mentioned earlier. Like, maybe just for your social emotional, you don't want to take all these high level classes.
And maybe that's why they have that more specific piece about the parents sign off.
So I think this year for us, we have parents through our online registration portal. We're using School Links. There's a place where parents need to confirm the student selections, and we're using that as, that is our parent approval process. That is they are not opting out from what their students have selected. They are approving it. So.
All right, well, maybe there'll be more guidance from ISB coming soon about some of this stuff, and it'll help those of us, before February, March, when we're all already done and staffing. So, all right. Is there anything else for the good of the order that people would like to talk about today, or maybe perhaps would be useful for whoever ends up hosting next in a couple weeks? Are there other issues that you'd like to see CADCA either have a speaker come in or us address maybe more in depth in the next month or two? I'm sure the leadership team would like to have some ideas of we could start recruiting some people. I think we already began talking about having someone from ISB come in to talk more about the ACT once they've actually signed the rules and that guidance comes out, that we maybe have somebody come in and talk a little bit more about that. Are there other topics that we would like to have? Tell me, or other suggestions of maybe a webinar or something you guys you've attended recently, you think all of us should be listening to or hearing more about? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time today. And I'll try to keep y'all apprised if I hear anything back from ISB so far on the exceeds part. And please reach out to John if you guys are interested in pursuing that. And I don't know. That's all I got. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. Hope you have a great first week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Will you be distributing the video
you.
from the Zoom?
I can do that, although I will say that John's presentation was pretty much just what's on the video online. I mean, minus some of our questions, but I can go ahead and send out the recording as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John, very
Yeah.
much.
See ya.
All right, talk to you later.